Greetings, Earthlings. Crazy Old Gringo here. Today, something I've been mulling over for quite a period of time. I've finally written on my blog post that you can find at crazyoldgringo.mx. That's crazyoldgringo.mx. A story about understanding the challenges of Western men abroad. Essentially, I've taken some resources from Jordan Peterson and a book called Men on Strike, a couple of various videos out there, a course I took from Yale University from Dr. Laurie Santos called The Science of Well-Being, and mashed them all into this writing that I think you'll find very interesting. This blog post will be hosted again by Sandy and Fred. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you find something interesting out of it. Keep your hands on the steering wheel, but enjoy.
Ever just scrolling through like your feed and you're like, wait, is this like a me thing or is this like a thing? That's what today's Deep Dive is all about.
Okay.
We are talking about men opting out.
Okay.
And like when I say that, I mean like the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
Marriage, kids, the 9 to 5, all of it.
I'm intrigued.
Yeah. So like it's interesting because it's not just like, anecdotal water cooler chat.
Right.
We're diving into some serious research, books, articles, even a Yale course on happiness to understand what's going on.
Well, that's great. I'm excited to dig into this. I feel like this is something that I've definitely seen pieces of, anecdotally, but I'm really interested to see, like, what is the data actually saying? Are we seeing a trend?
Yeah.
So let's get into it.
Okay, so first up, we got to define opting out right.
Yeah.
Our first source, Men on Strike, kind of throws out this idea of men going galt.
Okay.
Like full Ayn Rand, like checking out of society, dropping out.
Interesting.
So is that just a catchy phrase or is there something more to it?
Well, I think it's definitely a catchy phrase. I mean, it's definitely something that is gaining traction in certain circles online.
Right.
But I think the real question is, like, what's the why behind it?
Okay.
And this book seems to be pointing at a lot of these societal factors. So things like feeling like masculinity, traditional masculinity, is demonized.
Okay.
Or that the legal systems are biased against men, or feeling like they're getting negative portrayals in media.
Interesting.
So almost like this feeling of being told, you're the problem, not the solution.
That's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah.
I mean, but I've got to ask, it feels like a lot of what that book, at least, is drawing on is personal stories, right? So how much weight can we really give that? Because it feels like you can find a personal anecdote to support almost any viewpoint.
Oh, absolutely. And that's something to be really careful of. Just because you see a bunch of comments on a blog post or you overhear some guys chatting at a bar who are saying these things,
right,
doesn't necessarily mean it's representative of a wider trend.
Okay.
It might just be that, the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Right.
And so, it's one thing to take note of those feelings, but it's another thing to say, like, this is a scientific, poll that we've done, and these are actually representative.
Right, yeah.
So that's where these other sources come in, I think.
Okay.
Because it's like, okay, that's one perspective.
Right.
Let's see what else we can find. What other perspectives, what other, data points can we layer in?
Yeah. Which brings us to, I think, a fascinating, potentially controversial factor, which is IQ.
Okay.
Now, this wasn't specifically about men opting out.
Right.
But that YouTube video on IQ really made me think about societal expectations.
Yeah.
And who's even set up to feel like they can succeed.
Totally.
In today's world.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So it's interesting because we're not saying that men are the only ones dealing with this.
Right.
Right?
But this is kind of it's an interesting lens to kind of view this through.
Exactly.
Because it gets at some of these, I guess, more controversial aspects of innate ability.
Yeah.
And what does it even mean to be intelligent, and how do we measure that? And are we measuring the right things?
Right.
Because if we're measuring success based on certain metrics, and those metrics maybe are biased in a certain way, then, it's no wonder that people are going to feel like they're falling behind or they're not measuring up.
Yeah, it's like if the game is rigged.
Exactly.
And you don't even know how it's rigged.
Right, right.
But, something's off.
Yeah. You're like, I'm playing, but I just can't seem to get ahead.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah. And it is, and maybe this is a good place to jump into the IQ thing because, Jordan Peterson, who's the psychologist in that video, he makes this whole argument that as jobs are getting more complex, which they are, like you were just saying, there's this whole segment of the population that is just not equipped to thrive. And not because they're lazy, but because there are cognitive limitations.
It's just they literally don't have the processing power to do some of these jobs that are becoming.
And he even used the example, this is crazy to me, that the military has an IQ threshold of 83 for enlistment.
Yeah, it's a really stark thing to think about.
Yeah.
Because it's like we think about the military as being like, you gotta be really brave and strong.
Right.
And all those things. But it's like there's also this cognitive element.
Imagine if you, tried to enlist and they were like,
yeah,
not smart enough.
Sorry, you're not smart enough to be in the Army. It's like, what? How do you even process that?
That's a tough pill to swallow. Yeah.
So it's like, how much of opting out is really a choice?
Right.
And how much of it is people feeling I don't know, left behind?
I think that's a great question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure it's a spectrum, right? I'm sure there are some people for whom it is a very conscious.
Yeah.
I'm opting out of this system because I don't agree with it.
Right.
Or these are not my values and I'm going to create my own thing.
Right.
But then on the other end of the spectrum, I'm sure there are plenty of people who are just this is not working. I don't know what to do. I feel lost.
Checking out.
Yeah, exactly. And they might not even be able to articulate why.
Right. Yeah.
They just know that the path that's been laid out before them isn't working.
Right. And it's not leading where they want to go or thought it would lead. Or Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's a really, really important question to be asking is to what extent is this a choice?
Yeah.
And to what extent is this a response to circumstances that are largely outside of people's control?
And it makes you wonder, because even Peterson even went on to say that it's even what we consider to be basic tasks now involve computers.
Yeah, everything's digital.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, there's this whole element of digital literacy.
Absolutely.
That maybe didn't exist before.
Right, right.
And how much of that is contributing to this sense of, I don't know, inadequacy.
I think it probably plays a huge role, especially for men who were raised with this idea that being a man means being a provider.
Right.
And that means being good with your hands or being able to fix things or build a house.
Yeah.
And now it's well, you need to know how to code or you need to know how to troubleshoot a software problem.
Right. Yeah.
Or you need to know how to navigate the complexities of online marketing.
Right.
And it's those are not necessarily skills that are inherently valued in the same way.
Right, or taught in the same way.
Exactly, exactly.
You know what I mean?
So it's there's this whole skill mismatch that's happening where it's the skills that are needed to succeed in this new economy, in this digital economy, are not necessarily the skills that have been traditionally valued.
Right, or that people have had access to learn.
Exactly, exactly. So it's a tricky situation.
Yeah. And and just to be fair to Peterson and to be fair to this conversation.
Sure.
What he's saying is not, universally accepted.
Oh, of course.
He even mentions the bell curve in that,
right.
which is a whole other
Yeah. The bell curve is a whole other can of worms.
Yeah. Which we don't have to get into, but.
We don't have to get into it, but it's,
But I just think it's an important thing to acknowledge is in the room.
It's in the room, yeah. It's part of the larger conversation.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the things that's interesting about the bell curve is that it's been criticized a lot for its claims about IQ and socioeconomic mobility.
Right.
But I think what's valuable about it, even if you disagree with the premise, is that it forces us to ask these questions about well, how do we measure intelligence?
Right.
And are these measurements fair?
Right.
And are they accurately reflecting people's abilities?
And potential.
And potential, exactly.
Yeah.
So, I think it's a conversation that we need to be having.
Right.
Even if it's uncomfortable.
Yeah. And it feels like there's this whole undercurrent of am I good enough?
Yeah.
That I think, like, fuels a lot of this.
Totally, totally.
You know, and if the answer feels like no,
right,
then checking out starts to look real appealing.
Absolutely. If you feel like you're constantly being told that you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not this enough, you're not that enough.
You're not enough.
You're just not enough.
Yeah.
It's like, why would you want to keep participating in a system
Exactly.
that's telling you you're not good enough?
Right.
So it's a natural human response, I think.
Yeah. So before we, get too far down that path, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about a very specific type of opting out.
Okay, yeah.
Which is the expat.
Okay, interesting.
Right. Like leaving the country, opting out of your, I don't know.
Your home culture, yeah.
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 So we've got this blogger, and he is living the life over in the Philippines.
Okay.
Beautiful beaches. And he starts talking about how there are all these, Western men,
Interesting.
a lot of them his age, who are going over there, and they are seeking relationships with younger women. And I think on the surface, that sounds like, I don't know.
A little cliche.
Yeah, a little bit,
A little bit, yeah.
Like, we've heard that story before.
Right.
But he seems to be saying there's a little more to it than meets the eye.
Okay.
So I'm interested to get your take on that.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear what he has to say.
So, like, he really digs into some of the nuances.
Okay.
And it kind of raises the question, like, is this really opting out of societal expectations? Or just finding a different playing field where those expectations maybe are even reversed?
Yeah, and he talks about that a bit. You know, like the allure of escaping the pressures of Western society.
Right.
Right, and maybe finding a culture where, like, traditional masculinity is more valued.
Right.
Or at least perceived differently. But then he chose in this whole other thing about how a lot of these guys end up worse off.
Yeah, like, what's the deal with that?
Yeah, it's like, be careful what you wish for.
Right.
Because you might just get it.
Right.
And it might not be what you actually...
What you signed up for.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, he doesn't sugarcoat it.
Right.
He's like, these guys are falling prey to scams.
Right.
They're struggling financially to support their partners' families.
Right.
Sometimes facing, like, emotional fallout from relationships that maybe seemed idyllic at first.
And, like, the grass is always greener.
Right.
Until you get to the other side and you're like, oh.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like you're trading one set of challenges for another.
Right.
Which doesn't automatically equal happiness.
Right. And I think it's really easy to get caught up in the fantasy.
Oh, totally.
Especially when you're feeling, I don't know, disillusioned at home.
Especially when you're feeling burnt out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he even ties it back to that Yale happiness course, which I thought was interesting.
Oh, yeah.
This whole, like, hedonic adaptation thing.
Oh, right. Yeah, hedonic adaptation, which basically just means, like, we get used to things.
Wow.
So even if something is, like, a really big change in your life, like moving to the other side of the world,
right,
eventually you kind of adjust, and your baseline level of happiness tends to revert back to, like, whatever it was before.
It's like you can't outrun yourself.
Exactly. You can't outrun yourself. That's a good way to put it.
Right.
It's like you can change your environment, you can change your circumstances.
But you're still you.
Right.
And if you haven't done the work to address, like, the underlying issues or whatever it is that's making you unhappy, then you're probably going to end up
taking it with you.
Taking it with you. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's a really important thing.
Which is a whole other...
It's a whole other...
deep dive.
Deep dive. Exactly.
But it's like, he even seems to suggest that for some of these guys, it's not just about finding a different culture.
Right.
It's about finding a different version of themselves.
Yeah. Like, almost like they're looking for a place where they can be the man.
Right.
That they feel like they can't be in their home culture.
Exactly.
Right.
And maybe that's part of the allure.
Yeah, and that ties back into what we were talking about earlier with, like, societal expectations and, like, traditional masculinity and all of that.
Totally.
Like, if you feel like those things are no longer valued or they're even demonized in your home country, then it's natural to start looking for a place where
it's celebrated.
Where it's celebrated. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But I think the important thing is to be honest with yourself about, like, why you're doing it.
Right.
And to make sure that you're not just, like, running away from something.
Right.
But that you're actually running towards something that you actually want.
Because you can't escape yourself.
You can't escape yourself. That's the thing.
Yeah.
Like, you can try.
You can try.
But it's going to catch up with you eventually.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah, we have.
I mean, we've talked about men feeling disillusioned with their roles in Western society.
Yeah.
We've talked about the pressures of, like, economic instability.
Yeah.
Even the role of IQ in shaping our perceptions of success and worth.
Oh.
And now we're seeing how all of that can manifest in something as, like,
right.
seemingly drastic as packing up and moving to a new country.
Absolutely. And it really highlights this tension, I think, between like individual agency
right.
and like the influence of these larger societal forces.
Right.
You know, like, are these men making a conscious choice to opt out?
Right.
Or are they, in a way, being kind of pushed towards the margins?
Right.
You know?
Pushed out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's an easy answer to that question.
Right. And I think it's important to acknowledge that opting out can look very different depending on who you are.
Oh, absolutely.
And what your circumstances are.
Yeah, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Right.
You know, for some people, it might mean choosing not to get married or have kids.
Right.
For other people, it might mean walking away from a traditional career path.
Right.
To pursue something that's like less conventional.
Right.
Even if it means being less financially secure.
Yeah.
You know, like there's a lot of different ways to opt out.
Right.
And I think it's important to not judge people's choices.
Right.
Because we don't always know what's going on in their lives or what their motivations are.
And we haven't even touched on the financial aspect that much, which I think is huge.
It's huge.
For a lot of men.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like when you factor in things like the rising cost of living,
right?
Stagnant wages,
right?
The increasing expectation for both partners to be breadwinners,
right?
You know, it's easy to see how the traditional model of masculinity,
yeah,
which often equated like providing for one's family with success,
right?
It's like that model just doesn't work for a lot of people anymore.
It's like the rules of the game have changed, but nobody told us.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
The rules of the game have changed, but nobody got the memo.
Right. And that's incredibly frustrating.
Oh, yeah.
If you're like, I'm playing by the rules that I was taught.
Right.
And I'm still losing.
Yeah. And you're like, what am I doing wrong?
Right.
Like, I'm working hard. I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do.
Right.
But it's still not enough.
So with all that in mind,
yeah,
let's bring this back to our core question.
Okay.
What does it really mean to opt out?
Right, like what are we even talking about here?
It's almost like we need to like redefine winning, you know, in the 21st century.
Yeah.
Because like if the traditional markers of success, like marriage, career, house, all that,
right,
if those are feeling unattainable,
yeah,
or even just undesirable,
right,
then what's the alternative? What do we do?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And I don't think there is like a one-size-fits-all answer, you know?
Right.
Like I think it really depends on the individual. But what's interesting is that a lot of these sources, even though they have very different perspectives,
right,
seem to be saying that just opting out,
right,
without a clear sense of what you're opting into,
right,
can be kind of risky.
You know, it's like you can't escape yourself.
Right.
At the end of the day.
Yeah, so it's not just about running away from something. It's about running towards something.
Exactly.
And maybe that's where, like, that idea of Miss Wanting from the Yale course comes in.
Oh, interesting.
Like, we get so caught up in what we think is going to make us happy.
Right.
But really, it's like, what if we're wrong?
Yeah, what if we're chasing the wrong thing?
What if we're chasing the wrong thing?
What if we achieve all of those things and we're still not happy?
Exactly.
Then what?
Right.
So I think it really is about taking a step back and being honest with yourself about like,
right,
what truly matters to you? What are your values? What brings you joy? What gives you a sense of purpose?
And those answers might not fit in the boxes.
Yeah, exactly.
that we've been given.
Exactly. And that's okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's actually a good thing.
Right?
Because it means that we get to define success for ourselves.
Right. And maybe that's the real revolution here.
Yeah.
It's not men versus women or traditional values versus like modern life, but it's really just like all of us.
Yeah.
Reevaluating what it means.
Yeah.
To live a fulfilling life.
Totally. It's like, what does it mean to be a good human?
Yes.
What does it mean to be a good partner? What does it mean to be successful?
On your own terms.
On your own terms, exactly.
So we've covered a lot in this deep dive.
We have.
We've gone from like societal shifts to personal choices, from IQ scores to like expat adventures.
It's a lot. It's a lot to unpack. It's a lot, but if there's one thing I'm taking away from it, it's that the conversation is far from over.
Oh, absolutely. This is just the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
Like, we've just scratched the surface.
And as with any good deep dive, I think we're left with, like, more questions than answers.
Always.
Oh, maybe that's the point.
Right.
It's to start the conversation.
Yeah, get people thinking.
Challenge assumptions.
Exactly.
And ultimately, like, encourage each of us to define what opting in to a truly fulfilling life.
I love that, opting in.
Looks like, on our own terms.
Yes.
So, to our listener out there, what does opting in look like to you?